Is it misses me, or like you could drive 15 miles out in the middle of the country to a picnic table on the side of the road, and as soon as you sat down with the camera, there'll be 100 people come up there wanting to eat lunch on that picnic table. The weirdest thing I've ever seen. They told me a good way to grow my YouTube channel was to buy a 2-year-old camera that was already 2 years out of date when it was released and do a bunch of YouTube videos on it. So here we are doing another one about the A7C, and today we're going to compare it to the Fuji XS10. Now you may be asking yourself, why would one compare these two different cameras? They're so different. You know, obviously one's an APS-C camera and one's a full frame camera. But to me, they kind of fill the same roles as far as where they fit into my lineup. Kind of that small, inconspicuous camera. You can see the size difference between the two. The APS-C is, of course, going to be a lot smaller than the A7C. But with the larger size, you get a boost in performance as well. In some things. In some things, it's, you know, fairly close. Now, I did add a cage to my A7C, and while that give me a better grip on the camera, basically it made my camera the same size and weight as my A7 IV. So I don't know if that's going to be worth it or not. I'm still kind of testing that to see what I think. I'm going to stop the video right here just to say, if you've liked this video just any at all, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you really like it, go ahead and subscribe. Now back to the video. Now I made some notes, so you know I'm serious today. So I'll try not to forget anything. I'm gonna put my notes down there anyway. So anyway, we're gonna start off with the viewfinder of these two cameras. Neither one of these viewfinders are very good, if you ask me. But the good thing about it is I don't think that they're necessary in the use of these cameras. I don't think that's what they were meant for. I think both of these cameras are back screen cameras, where you just use the back screen, you know, to frame up your shots and stuff like that. I don't think that the viewfinders are really even meant for much use, and definitely not meant for heavy use. Now going to the screens a little bit, they're both pretty crappy screens. I mean, the Sony screen is legendary for being just overall bad quality. You have to get it into the sunny weather setting, or you're not going to be able to see it out in the sun at all. Fuji screen seems to be a little bit better as far as the quality goes, you know, being able to see what's going on in your screen. The added bonus with the Fuji is you can touch the screen and change some of your settings. On the Sony, you're only able to touch your screen for focus. So that's a little bit of a difference between the two screens. When we get into the battery life, there's really not much of a comparison here. The Fuji XS10 battery is just not very good. Over a day of shooting, you're probably going to need at least 3 batteries if you're going to be shooting throughout the day. The Sony that has a bigger, larger Z battery in there, maximum 2 batteries will get you through the whole day. So the battery life is definitely going to the Sony on this one. Let's talk about the SD cards for a little bit. In the Sony, where the SD card, it's over here on the side, and I tend to like that a little bit better than the Fuji, which is down here in the battery compartment. And I found that the battery compartment, putting the SD card in the battery compartment, it's a little bit harder to get to. Like, you have to dig for it just a little bit, as opposed to the Sony. It's just really easy to pop in and pop out. You can also do it with while your camera's on a tripod. Makes it super easy to change out the SD card. The Sony is UHS 2 and the Fuji is only UHS 1. And that doesn't make much of a difference until you start pulling stuff off the memory card into your computer. If you have like some large files, it's going to take a long time to get that off your Fuji, or a lot longer than it is the UHS 2 cards of the Sony. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're choosing between these two cameras. We talk about the button and the overall general layout of these two cameras. I tend to like the Fuji just a little bit better, even though it has a more minimalist style. You have a couple buttons on top there. You have a couple buttons in back, and then you have this display back and menu button. But the joystick, which you're going to be using a lot, because to do any kind of focusing, you're going to have to move that focusing point around a lot. Luckily, the joystick falls in just a perfect spot, and it's really easy to move around the focus spot with the joystick. So overall, I enjoy the layout of the Fuji X-S10 much better than I do the Sony A7C. This dial over here on the left hand side, it was set to only change the picture profile on the fly. And I thought that was all you could do with it for the longest time until I recently figured out that you can actually change that. So I changed that to ISO. That has really changed the way I use this camera, because before the ISO button was on the top, it was kind of a pain in the butt to get to. With this camera, you're going to be wanting to change your ISO or set your ISO values. I'll go into a little bit in that until later as far as how it affects autofocus, but being able to actually change the ISO to this dial has really helped me be able to use this camera better. Now, as far as the Sony goes, I mean, you have a very minimum setup here. There's not very many buttons. There's not many dials. There's not even a front dial, and there's one on the Fuji. So when you get into changing your settings around, it can be a little bit confusing and a little bit taxing. If you're in manual mode, you may have to, I mean, it takes a second. I mean, it's just not, you know, maybe once you use the camera for a while, it becomes muscle memory. But for me right now, it's kind of a pain to make my way around the camera using the buttons and stuff. But the main problem I have with the button layout is the menu button being right there in the center of the screen. If you can see that. Like if you're holding the camera like this, you're definitely going to be using your left hand to hit the menu button. Well, when you do that, you come across the eyepiece. When you come across the eyepiece, it turns off your screen. So you're always having to, you know, the screen and the eyepiece is always toggling back and forth. So I had to set up the on-off for the toggle to be, and I had to use a custom button, one of the few custom buttons on this camera, to toggle between the screen and the eyepiece, because I kept triggering it on and off. Kind of a pain there, but overall I enjoy using the Fuji camera better as far as the layout of the camera goes. Let's talk about the menu system a little bit. Let's be really quick. The Sony uses the old menu system, which sucks. It is so clunky, so confusing, and there's so many options that it's just really hard to navigate yourself around. So what I try to do on that is I try to set as much stuff in the function menu as I can, so I don't have to get into the menu section. And then also I will go into my menu and put the things that I want to change regularly in there, so I'm not having to thumb through any kind of the menus while I'm actually using the camera, because there's so many options and stuff. It just gets so confusing and can be really overwhelming. And then like sometimes you just want to change one thing and you can't really remember where it is, so that makes you go through, you know, you'll go through 14 pages on tab 1 and 14 pages on tab 2, then, you know, you can't find it. It just gets really frustrating like that, you know. Fuji, it's not much better, to be honest with you. I mean, I think things are a little bit laid out a little bit more intuitively, and their icons make more sense and everything, but it's just as complicated, and there's just as many things to change and fine-tune in the Fuji as there is the Sony. It's just laid out a little bit better, but to be honest with you, they're both not very good, and they both can be overwhelming, especially if you're not familiar with any system. As far as the video aspects of these cameras, they do about the same, you know. 4K 30 in both of them. They'll both do 60 frames a second in 1080, and they'll both do 120 frames per second in 1080. The Fuji will do 240 frames in 1080, but it doesn't look very good, but it's a pretty cool feature to have, and I use it sometimes. But as far as the specs of the camera go, they pretty much do about the same stuff. Let's talk about autofocus just a little bit. The autofocus on the Sony is just going to blow away the Fuji autofocus. I mean, it's not even going to be close on that. So one of the tricks that I found with the Fuji autofocus, if you're using your camera like this and you have your face and eye auto detect on, eventually it's going to lose you, especially if you're wearing any kind of sunglasses. It's going to lose you. So make sure you have your box in the center of the frame, and just make sure you keep yourself in the center of the frame, and it shouldn't do any kind of jarring, you know, back and forth too bad. Even if it loses your face and eye, it'll pick you up, and then everything should be fine. The only problem that I have with using that is, and this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier on the exposure, is I like to shoot with ISO and auto. So I like to set my shutter speed and set my aperture and let the ISO kind of do what it does. Well, the problem with that on the Fuji becomes when, if you're shooting, it locks your photometry, I think is what they call it. Basically, it locks your exposure. You can't choose how it's going to expose. When it shoots and gets your eyes, it exposes for your face. Does a great job of doing that. But as soon as it loses your face, it goes to the square and it exposes for the whole scene. So the exposure kind of goes up and down based on if it has your eye or not. And that's kind of become distracting. Since I've changed that dial over there to the side, I had to set my own ISO when I'm shooting with the Fuji. I won't get into that distracting exposure stepping, and that all has to do with the face and eye auto-tech not being able to lock in just perfectly set on your eye. And sometimes it loses you, change your exposure when you're in automatic modes. So the Sony, it just has great autofocus. There's nothing more that can say about that. Never had any issues with it. Has the touch tracking, which is nice. Use that on a few things, and it's just really, really in a class of its own as far as these two cameras go, as far as the autofocus goes. So we'll talk about the images and color a little bit. There's a huge difference between full frame and APS-C. You can get that just awesome background with full frame that you can get a little bit of blur with APS-C, but not as much, and you gotta have that tone, what you give up in tone, you gain in size of your lenses and size of your overall kit. So that's just something that you kind of need to decide for yourself. I'm kind of leaning more towards full frame, but certainly I don't mind pulling out the APS-C from time to time when I think it's necessary. I think it takes great pictures, great videos. The APS-C I don't feel has ever held me back, and maybe a little bit in low light, maybe where you get run into just a little bit of noise problems. But other than that, you're not going to notice that much of a difference. Now the color of the two cameras is just Sony's just okay, they've changed the color science a couple of times, and the A7C does have the new color science in it. And I don't have any problem with the color. It is what it is. It looks natural. It looks real to life. It looks good. There's just something to say for the colors coming out of the Fuji. And a lot of that has to do with the film simulations. For video, I use a Turna, but I'm kind of leaning more towards Provia or Standard recently. But either one, the colors just look great coming out of them. And then when you're taking photos, you have all these different film simulations like classic chrome and classic negative and all those film simulations, and they just look so good. It's really hard to put down. It's really hard to put down the Fuji when you can get, like I put it in bracketing mode. You can get 3 different looks, right away from your photos, and you don't have to touch any kind of editing at all. So it's really hard. It's really hard for me to just do away with this camera because they make it so easy to get great looking photos. The Sony pictures look great, they look clean, they look nice, but they are what they're pretty safe. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just, man, once you start shooting some Fuji pictures, especially if you don't like to edit your photos a lot, you just can't beat that Fuji. You can't beat them Fuji JPEGs. You just can't beat them. So anyway, I can't believe I went through this whole video without mentioning the video stabilization out of either one of these cameras. Straight out of the camera, I think that the XS10 is going to do a better job than the A7C, unless you're using the 16-80 lens. In my opinion, that lens just doesn't stabilize well at all and looks really bad. But you're never going to get the XS10 footage as stable as you can the A7C's footage when you run it through Catalyst Browse. So in my mind, it's just about a wash. That's just a quick little comparison between the Sony A7C and the Fuji XS10. Now, if you want to see sample footage, I've shot many videos with the Fuji XS10, and I've shot just a few videos with the A7C, but enough to give a good sample size on my channel. So go back and watch some of those videos if you want to see sample footage of any of those two. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.